Welcome to the TDS Early Years podcast. Now, each week we're going to be joined by different educational experts from across the globe who are going to offer exclusive insights, inspiration and guidance to help us as practitioners unlock all the potential for learning that there is in the early years. So to be first to hear about future episodes and to access all of the follow-up content, including ideas for your own setting, Pinterest, mood boards, and loads more, you can sign up for exclusive access using the link in our podcast description. Hello and welcome to TDS Talking Early Years podcast with me, Alistair Bryce-Clegg. And today I am joined again by a global nature pedagogy expert, if you like that title, Niki Buchan. And Niki, what I want to talk about in this episode is you and I have both had the great privilege of being able to work around the world in early childhood settings, particularly for you looking at that kind of element of nature pedagogy. More difficult to say than it is to do. Are there any things that stand out for you in terms of settings you've visited internationally and how they've really enhanced that approach with great success, and others who've struggled a little bit more with it?
Okay, what I find interesting, Alistair, is that traveling around the world and looking at different countries, children play the same way, and they play like I used to play as a child. And you don't have to understand the language. I can be in South Korea or I can be in China, and I watch the children play, and I go, I know exactly what they're thinking. I know exactly what they're doing, and a lot of it is things that I did. So it's not the children; it's the adults that make the difference. And I would say one of the biggest differences I've found is our attitude to risk and how much freedom we allow the children. So in Australia and in the UK, I think we are much more risk averse. So there's a greater concern that children might get hurt. So it's a bit as if we're fearful of an awful lot of things. So the attitude to risk is very different in Australia and the UK to most of the other countries that I've been in. And in those countries, it's accepted that children are going to get childhood injuries. They're going to get scrapes and scratches and things like that.
That interesting concept around culture and practice. And so the idea that you get to experience lots of practice and then you try and pick it up and drop it into a culture that isn't ready for that kind of practice. So you've got this huge fear of litigation in the UK because people have been sued for, or the myth or the catastrophizing around, you know, if I don't send that letter home, then the parent's going to sue me or whatever it may be. But again, I think there's some truth in that, and there will be some settings that have been sued by parents for various injuries that have occurred. But there's also a culture you can build as a setting where you say to parents who are arriving on your doorstep, this is how we are here, this is what we do, and this is why. And if that makes you uncomfortable as a parent, then we're probably not the space for you to bring your child. But actually, if you look at what our children do, what we experience, what we produce, look at the fine, young humans that we've got in this space, that's our advert for why what we do works.
Definitely. I think having those conversations with the families, I also find it's very helpful to talk to them about their own childhood and what did they do as children, what were their fondest memories. And, if I'm sitting in a room talking to 1,000 people, the hands just go up and the noise levels go up as they all talk to each other. And then they get more and more animated as they talk about all the things they did as children. And what comes through a lot is that they were unsupervised a lot of the time. So the best memories are when the adults aren't there, because then that you could get up to all kinds of mischief and make mistakes. And then with that comes what we call learning injuries. And I've got scars, and I know exactly where I got them from. And they're childhood memories, and they're also learning injuries because I learned something through that scar. Nothing catastrophic. But and then I find if I say to the parents, do you want that childhood for your child? That's quite powerful. And I think the other thing to consider is with our culture in Australia and in the UK of filling in these accident forms, and then very often we also apologize to the parent because their child's got a scrape or a scratch. And the message we're giving the parents is that we've had to fill in this stupid accident form that's going to be around for 20-something years because the child had a minor scrape or was going to have a little bit of a bruise. we are making parents think that these normal childhood injuries are actually something much more serious. So I think it's important that we rethink that and take from the other cultures. And, if you look at the happiness rates in, Finland, Norway, Iceland, and all those things, and academic scores so much higher than in our countries.
Yeah, and I think you're dead right. It's about balance, and it's about the fact that obviously if a child has had a significant injury or, something that may result in them being ill or unwell, that needs reporting. But we are in a culture of literally, if you get a bump on the, which you can't see and it's not going to hurt you, or a graze or whatever it may be. And I like the idea of learning injuries. I mean, at 53, I've got a scar on my left knee, which bizarrely I'm now leaning down and touching, which is just obviously very strange to do on a podcast. I have a scar on my left knee, which I got from falling out of a tree. And I cut my knee quite badly. Not that it needed stitching, but it bled a lot and it hurt. But again, it wasn't fatal. And I learned an awful lot in that about, my tree climbing technique. And it didn't stop me climbing trees. And again, like you, I'm going back to being brought up in a very small mining village in the northeast of England in the early 70s, where we all wore, flares and went out and just, experienced the world of nature around us. And yeah, I think it was a really valid question of, do you want that for your children? And I think my answer to that would have been absolutely yes. And actually, when you look at the statistics around, is the world a more dangerous place now than it was way back in the 70s? The answer to that is no, it isn't. But what we know because of media and things like social media is we hear more about the things that the bad things that happen, but more bad things aren't happening. So I think, again, as adults, it's about reconditioning ourselves to allow children to have that experience.
Yeah. And Richard Louv says it's a rite of childhood passage to you have to step on a rusty nail and you have to break a bone.
Yeah.
And I have to say, I've never touched wood. I'm too old now, but I've never broken a bone. But all through my childhood, I was desperate to break a bone. I so badly wanted that plaster cast, and everybody's signing it. And even now, I sometimes see people put posts up on social media and they say, I'm in hospital with Emily. And then everybody goes, what's happened? Are you all right? What's happened to Emily? I hope you're all right. And then they wait until the list gets sort of quite long. And then they'll say, oh, she's broken her arm. And then there's a picture of Emily sitting on her bed with this biggest smile on her face and the plaster cast. Like, look what I got. Look what I did. So, and I also love Lady Jane Allen of Hurtwood, who created the first adventure playgrounds in the UK. And she says, rather a broken bone than a broken spirit. Because a broken bone will heal and a spirit might not. And
which is a real truth. And again, an easy thing to say, and I think for lots of people listening, they would kind of struggle with the thought that you might be, we're not actively promoting the breaking of bones, but just saying it's accepted that this is a normal part of our child's development. But that idea of the fact that if you can experience life in its fullest as much as you possibly can, there may be small injury, physical, but you are literally building that well-being, self-esteem, resilience, all the things that we need more of in life than we ever did before.
And I think also we mustn't underestimate how much we learn, as you said, with the tree climbing, by having those accidents. And so children learn about what they're capable of doing and what they can't do. And the younger the child, when we allow them to do that, or the smaller the child, the smaller the incidents generally. And, as we get older, they get bigger. And I remember watching a 16-year-old going on a zip line. Now, do you call them zip lines in the UK? I get confused. Yeah, you call them zip lines. They're called flying foxes in Australia. But the zip line, they're called foofy slides in South Africa. They're all the same thing. But and I've watched a 16-year-old boy get onto, hang on to the zip line and let go, let his legs go, and he plummeted quite a height because he didn't realize that he was not able to hold his body weight on that zip line. So those are, once we understand our bodies and what we can and can't do, then it makes it it makes us much safer.
Yeah, and I think little children are really good at that because they often are more fearless, because why wouldn't you be? You're just exploring the world that's around you, and we get more fearful as we get older. So if you can conquer some of those fears and get that really good knowledge of who you are and what your body can do at the time when your body is developing, then you literally are getting the best of both worlds.
And children, and it fascinates me how we as adults, when a child's learning to walk, we put them on their feet and they fall and we pick them up and put them back on their feet. The minute they can walk, we go, don't run, don't climb. It's as if we want to stop that progress, but we were quite happy for that initial progress. So the risky stuff, I find that's quite a big difference between UK, Australia and other parts of the world.
Yeah, so I think there's and risk is on a scale. So there isn't. I think there are national attitudes towards risk, and you're dead right. Loads of settings that I work in where they've got long corridors, because often schools are built in that way, and they've got this constant mantra of they used to say don't run, but then we're trying to reframe it in a more positive way. So things like walking feet. Let's see walking feet, and I kind of think, what did you expect that they were going to do? One of the first schools I ever worked in had a very long corridor in the middle of which there had been 6 steps, but there was a concern that infant children couldn't negotiate up and down 6 steps. So they put a ramp on instead. So basically the children used to wait till there was nobody there and run from one end of the corridor and run down or up the ramp, and loved it. And the lady who worked in the office just spent her entire day shouting down the corridor, stop running down the ramp. And I did think when I first went there, I would like to run down the ramp every time what do you think they're going to do? And also, let's take the ramp out and get the steps back in. So I think there is that. Sometimes we have to, as adults, challenge the nonsense that sometimes we just do stuff because we've always done it. And nobody ever stops and says, why are we talking about the weather, not going out in the weather? Why are we saying to children who are exploring the physicality of their bodies, don't run or move in a particular way? So sometimes it's about having those conversations with yourself or with your team and just saying, right, if we take this back to child development, then we would do it differently. And we're not. We are literally approaching pedagogy because of the restrictions that are placed on us by what society thinks children should be, often linked to academic achievement, as opposed to how children learn. And that's why nature-based pedagogy is a gift, because it just allows children to develop as children should develop.
Yeah, and they in their natural environment. And Alistair, the other thing I notice when I go and work with children in other countries is those children tend to be much calmer than the children I see in the UK and Australia. They tend to be fewer behaviours that challenge, and over time I've come to realise that I think what the biggest difference is that the children are not overstimulated by too many toys and too many resources. So in Australia and again in the UK, educators spend a lot of time creating amazing spaces, lots of toys, lots of equipment. But when I go to Italy or Iceland, there's just about nothing on the walls. They have a few books or a few dolls, and it's space. It feels calm. There's not much there, but the children play very creatively and very deeply, whether that's inside or outside. And I think with Forest School or some of the nature-based practice that I'm seeing, educators or practitioners are starting to fall into that. We've got to bring buckets, and we've got to bring spades, and we've got to have all these different resources. When actually, by just giving them wooden logs and sticks and leaves and water and sand, soil, maybe some river stones, they will find that the children are much, much calmer, and that there's a much deeper level of play. That has been very obvious looking at, I was recently in Iceland and in Italy and Germany and, lots of the other countries. The children are much, much calmer, and the whole pace of living is slower. Everything's slowed down. So there's not this frenetic energy that we certainly have in Australia.
And I think part of that is also an expectation from practitioners that those children will lead their own learning. And I think we can get into a culture, especially again in the UK, where if you are theme-based or topic-based and you set up activities for the children to make a this or to produce a that, so the very outcome-driven opportunities, then the children learn to expect an outcome, and they learn to expect instruction, and they learn to expect that resources will be provided. And what you're talking about is saying, right, I'm just going to give you access to a range of resources for you to interpret. And then as an adult, I'm going to watch. I might not intervene. I might intervene. I'm going to scaffold. I'm going to teach, but I'm going to do it through your engagement with the space, as opposed to saying, right, today we're all going to make a whatever it may be, and everybody makes one, which, you know, nobody died, but it trains children's brains as learners to have an expectation of what learning is. And also, for me, it stifles that element of creativity, because you're not asking me to think, you're not asking me to try and fail, you're not asking me to experience cause and effect. You're asking me to follow a sequence of events that result in a predetermined outcome, which was actually determined by you and not me. And so I think, again, it's about challenging that culture about how children learn and going against some of the beliefs that we've got as practitioners around what good learning or best practice looks like.
I think you've got a really good point there about, the children waiting to be told what to do. And because I often see children, when you first take children who are not used to being in nature into a natural space, and you say, and then they say, what am I supposed to do here? How do I play that? So they're waiting for some kind of instruction. They've never used their imagination to, and that they've never used objects as symbols of something else. So they're used to indoors. We give them replica phones and replica kitchens and everything's replica, and they look very realistic. But when you go out in nature, the children will pick up a stone and that becomes the money, or they'll pick up a piece of wood and then they'll phone Bob the Builder quickly to come and fix something that's broken. Yeah. And again, that symbolism, using symbols, linking that to literacy, I just see that the outside space is so much more valuable. Actually, one other point with difference that I've seen is the expectations of documenting so much of the children's day. And I think what's happening, and that the countries where it's much calmer, educators or practitioners have time to sit and observe and watch the children. They're not constantly walking around with cameras or iPads or bits of paper trying to write down what the children are doing. And there is no requirement to document everything. We're not their autobiographers. So again, that there's not that pressure and expectation on practitioners in Iceland or South Africa or Norway or Finland. There's very little documentation happens, but they know their children really well. They're 100% there for the children.
Which I think is a lovely point to end this episode on, that kind of thought of knowing your children is the most important thing rather than documenting their everyday existence. And so in the next episode, we're just going to be talking about pulling all the elements we've discussed together and the idea of how do you make your outdoor space truly outdoor, but also how do practitioners articulate children's achievements and attainments in that outdoor space. So once again, thank you, Niki, for your excellent insight and brilliant ideas.
Thank you, Alistair. I enjoyed chatting to you.
So I would just like to say a huge thank you to Niki Buchan for joining us and providing such brilliant insights into nature-based pedagogy throughout the world. You've been listening to the TTS Talking Early Years podcast with me, Alistair Bryce-Clegg, and of course with the wonderful Niki Buchan. If you've been inspired by what we've been talking about today, then don't forget you can sign up via the link in the episode notes, and then you'll be the first to hear about any future podcasts, but you can also access some really useful follow-up content, including lots of ideas for your setting and Pinterest boards that will help you shop for nature-based resources.